Now, as I said to you, it will take a long time for me to talk about so many different aspects of the facts of the case and of evidence and of sources. And we don't have the time to do that. But just to go back to the whiteboard, let me again show you what I've done this far, right? I've said we first come up with a problem for analysis. Then when we answer that problem, when we respond to it, we of course offer an explanation. This explanation consists of argument and narrative, on the basis of which we make a claim. We make a claim, हम दावा करते हैं कि ऐसा ही हुआ. This claim should be based on facts of the case. The facts of the case should be based on evidence. The evidence should of course be looked at, examined critically from different points of view, as I've explained. And the evidence comes from what we call primary sources, or sources that were created at the time about which we are writing. So these are three things that I've said about the construction of history. And I would say that we need to come up with, you know, 2 or 3 other elements that are very significant. Okay. I've said 4 things basically. I've told you about facts, and fourth is evidence in the sources, and then 5 and 6 are left. We can take a break now, and I can come back to elements 5 and 6 in a little while after a 5-minute break. Okay, thank you. So until now, we've been talking about problems for analysis, an explanation or a claim which consists of argumentation and narrative. And then we've said, what are the facts of the case? What is the evidence, and where does the evidence come from? What kinds of sources are being used? And we, of course, need to investigate the nature of the evidence and the types of sources used, right? Let me now ask you that once we interconnect these, do you think this in itself is enough for the construction of history? When we write history, are these the main elements in its writing, or is there some other element as well? Let me ask you this question. Is there a 5th element?
Sir, once again repeat.
So my question is that apart from the 4 elements that I've talked about, namely problem for analysis, argument and narrative, facts of the case, and number 4, evidence and sources, apart from these, is there a 5th element in the writing of history?
Interpretation.
Interpretation. Okay. Okay. Now, what is meant by interpretation?
Okay.
Can you give me some other words for interpretation?
Yes, Abhijit. Okay. So, interpretation, when we have the facts, okay. So, and when we have the main thing is the facts, okay. The way you are, it depends upon mind to mind, okay. The way you are, I think, observing the fact, okay. And the second and the important point is that you need to contextualize the facts
is like
through the evidence.
Right.
Contextualize the facts through the evidence.
Through the evidence. Okay.
Yes. Yes, sir. And after, and then one aspect which is very important, the narrative. Okay. So, okay. So narrate the facts through the evidence.
Yes. वो तो बात फैक्ट्स और एविडेंस की तो हो गई, सोर्सेज की भी हो गई. अब आपने कहा कि एक अगली चीज है इंटरप्रिटेशन, राइट? एंड यू सेड that interpretation basically means that how are you looking at the facts? From what angle of vision are you looking at the facts? You said it is a
Yeah.
matter of the mind. There are people have different minds of their own, and
Yes.
therefore different historians will look at the same facts in a different way.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
अभिजीत आप कुछ कह रहे थे?
एक पॉइंट और
जैसे
है
वो
सर.
थोड़ा सा डिस्टरबेंस आ गया. Sir, I was saying कि whenever interpretation is done according to the capacity of that researcher, and that has been examined by the supervisor and other faculties of the department whenever the paper is presented in the seminar. So when thesis and antithesis, people raises questions, and then they keep keep correcting, or sorry to say correcting, keep enriching the argument.
Refining it, yeah.
One point, sir, which I need to answer.
And that gives us the multi-dimensional understanding of that particular history that researcher is talking.
Right, right. Yes, Sushil. Yeah, tell me.
Yes, sir. One point is that, sir, that you have mentioned all the things, a point which you have already raised. For whom? These all the things for whom? Okay. Yes. And all the facts, evidence, narratives, these all the things for for society, culture, material, milieu, all the things. Okay.
Right, right.
ये सारे जो है सो उसी से रिलेटेड हैं. सभी चीजें नैरेटिव है, फैक्ट है, एविडेंस है, लेकिन ये किसके लिए है तो, या किसके संदर्भ में और किसके लिए और किसके द्वारा. ठीक है. ये मटेरियल मिल्यू के द्वारा, सोसाइटी के द्वारा, इकोनॉमी के द्वारा, पॉलिटिक्स के द्वारा, और जितने भी हमारे पास मतलब ये रॉ मटेरियल्स हैं उसको इंटरप्रेट करने के लिए.
जी
हम जी सभी के द्वारा हम उसको अपने फैक्ट्स को ये करते हैं, इंटरप्रेट करते हैं, उसको उसी के संदर्भ में कंटेक्चुअलाइज करने की कोशिश करते हैं. जी सर.
जी देखिए, करेक्ट. आई अंडरस्टैंड व्हाट यू आर सेइंग.
यस.
तो मैंने ये मॉडल बनाया था. अब आपने इसमें, आप दोनों ने मिलके इसमें एक पांचवी चीज डाली है. And that fifth element is basically what you have said, interpretation. I will use the word perspective. Right? From what perspective are we looking at the facts? From what perspective are we looking at the evidence? And as Abhijit said, a peer review happens. People argue about the nature of the evidence and the sources and the facts presented. And through that peer review, there is argumentation, there is discussion. Through that discussion, there is refinement, correction or refinement of the argument, as he said. It is enriched further and it becomes more weighty, right? Now, Now, when all of that happens, people are looking at things from different perspectives. This we all know. Basically, perspective means that there is a vantage point. There is an angle of vision, right? I can say angle of vision. Literally in Hindi, drishti kon, angle of vision. In Urdu, nazariya, right? और नुक्ता ए निगाह, निगाह का नुक्ता कौन सा है, पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू क्या है. So perspective is angle of vision, it is point of view, right? It is vantage point. Now, within perspective, there can be at least three things that are significant. One, what is the difference between perspective and prejudice or bias? Is perspective the same as bias, or is it different? So would anybody like to talk about this?
Yes, bias is different from perspective.
How? How will you tell anybody what is perspective and what is bias?
Bias means a propensity towards or towards our propensity towards something else.
Right,
Okay.
right.
Okay. Yes. This is also called the lacuna. We can say the lacuna in writing of history. Okay. Okay. As we have mentioned in the courtly culture. Okay. When we study about the courtly culture, then the court poet, okay, their propensity or their inclination towards the rulers. Okay. Here is the biasness in history, in writing.
Right.
Okay. Yes, sir.
I think
yes.
Yeah, Abhijit.
Abhijit.
I think perspective carries our biasness. Like it's a part, we cannot separate our biasness from our perspectives.
Yeah, so this is the question that I'm raising. Can you separate perspective from bias, or can you not? Shishir thinks you can separate the two.
Sir,
Abhijit thinks you cannot separate the two. I don't know what Umeshji thinks.
Yes, one
जी,
thing, sir.
Umeshji for a
जी,
minute.
जी,
Yes,
जी,
sir.
जी, 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 जी। मुझे लगता है कि दोनों ही चीजें हो सकती हैं। ये डिपेंड करता है पर्सन टू पर्सन, क्योंकि जो आपका जो ये जो पर्सपेक्टिव है, एक मायने में तो पर्सपेक्टिव ये होता है कि ओवरऑल जो अंडरस्टैंडिंग आपकी चीजों को लेकर के होती है, जिसमें आपने उसके बारे में पढ़ा है, उससे जो समझ बनी है, उस समझ के बेसिस पर होगा। और बायसनेस बेसिकली एक तरह का वो होता है जो स्टीरियोटाइप चीजें चली आती होती हैं उसको लेकर के। तो बेसिकली हम ये समझते हैं कि जो एक तरह से जब आप क्वेश्चन रेज करते हैं, तर्क करते हैं, तो आप अपने उस तरह के जो आपके बायस हैं उसको आगे नहीं बढ़ाएंगे। लेकिन बहुत सारे लोग अपने बायस को भी पर्सपेक्टिव का हिस्सा बना लेते हैं। तो ये दोनों चीजें हो सकती हैं।
No, वो एक्चुअलिटी में ऐसा हो सकता है। ओके शिशिर, या टेल मी। शिशिर, या।
यस सर, मैं एक बात और मैं कहना चाहता हूँ सर, जब हम देखते हैं एक कलहन की, ठीक है, कलहन वो इम्पार्शियल हिस्ट्री की बात करते हैं। ओके। और दूसरे साइड दूसरा पॉइंट है कि यहाँ इम्पार्शियल और पार्शियल यानी बायसनेस की दो बातें हैं। एक इम्पार्शियल की बात करता है, दूसरा पार्शियल यानी बायसनेस की बात करते हैं। इसी तरह से जो पर्सपेक्टिव की बात जैसे कि हम देखते हैं, तो मेनी स्कूल्स, वी हैव सेवरल स्कूल्स, okay, in I think the analysis school, the Marxist schools, postmodern, several schools, but उनका एक अपना नजरिया लेके वो चलते हैं। और इसी संदर्भ में जब हम देखते हैं कि पॉजिटिव स्कूल ने जो रैंकी ने जो क्वेश्चन किया, देन पोस्ट मॉडर्निस्ट स्कूल ने उसके क्वेश्चन पे जो है सो प्रहार किया। ठीक है, तो यहाँ ये उनका अपना नजरिया है, ये इनका अपना नजरिया। और इसी नजरिए में अगर जैसे अभिजीत ने कहा कि पर्सपेक्टिव में ही बायसनेस निहित है, तो अभिजीत की ये बातें हमें यहाँ सही लगता है कि जैसे एक पर्सपेक्टिव मेरा है ले जाने कैरी करने का, कोई स्कूल के पर्सपेक्टिव को उसी नजरिए से हम हिस्ट्री को सिचुएट करते हैं, फैक्ट को एनालाइज सिचुएट करते हैं और उसको इंटरप्रेट करते हैं। तो यहाँ हमें जी सर
नहीं, क्लियरली आप मुझे ये बताइए कि जो टर्म पर्सपेक्टिव है और जो टर्म प्रेजुडिस या बायस है, are they two different things or are they the same thing? As terms, are they different?
Yes, terms are different.
As concepts, are they different or not? I'm not saying what happens in reality. In reality, some perspectives may be prejudiced. That's correct. And some perspectives may not be. But the word or the term perspective, does it have the same meaning as the word bias?
नहीं, वो तो नहीं है।
नहीं है ना? So what is the difference?
जी, both is different. Yeah.
What is the difference?
Different, I think in analysis. एनालिसिस में डिफरेंट है. इंडिपेंडेंटली पर्सपेक्टिव एक अलग चीज है, लेकिन डिपेंड करता है हमारे एनालिसिस में.
Okay, let me say what I have to say.
उसमें ये है ना कि जो बायसनेस है वो उसके लिए एविडेंस फैक्ट्स की जरूरत नहीं होती है, और जो आपका पर्सपेक्टिव है उसके लिए एविडेंस एंड फैक्ट्स की जरूरत पड़ती है.
नहीं, जो आपका पर्सपेक्टिव है उसमें एविडेंस और फैक्ट्स की जरूरत पड़ती है. हो सकता है कि जो बायस है, जो प्रेजुडिस है, वो बेसलेस हो, उसके पीछे कोई एविडेंस या फैक्चुअल बेसिस ना हो. This I agree with you, but the point is that how will you define these words? What is prejudice? How will you define it? Right? This is the central issue.
I think
the other point is that why is this correct? I'm going to say something. Please tell me whether this is correct or not. Okay. While histories are based on evidence and fact, they are also necessarily based on perspective. Every history has some perspective or the other, but every perspective may not be biased.
Yeah.
Correct? So
Yes.
that means even if perspectives are based on evidence and facts, there is something more to the story than mere evidence and fact. There is a way of looking at things. There is an angle of vision. There is an interpretation. The interpretation may be valid or not valid. If it is not valid, it means it is not based on evidence and facts or on adequate evidence and facts. If it is valid, it is based on adequate evidence and facts. But nonetheless, I think this is true, that all history writing has to happen from some perspective. And number two, all perspectives need not be prejudiced. Correct? So how do we define these terms? I think on the question of prejudice, I can do no better than quote a man called Bernard Lewis. Bernard Lewis. He wrote a book called History Remembered, Recovered, Invented. And there he describes what is prejudice or what is bias. And I read out to you, he says, the essential and distinctive feature of scholarly research is, or should be, that it is not directed to predetermined results. The historian does not set out to prove a thesis or select material to establish some point, but follows the evidence where it leads. No human being is free from human failings, among them loyalties and prejudices which may color his perception and presentation of history. The essence of the critical scholarly historian, is that he's unaware of this fact, and instead of indulging his prejudices, seeks to identify and correct it. The essence of the critical scholarly historian is that, he's aware of this fact. He is aware of this fact, and instead of indulging his prejudices, seeks to identify and correct them. So what he's saying is that everybody has prejudices. हर एक के अपने पूर्वाग्रह हैं. But as critical scholarly historians, we are taught to question our prejudices and to base our arguments, as Umeshji said, on evidence and fact. And if we are able to do this and throw out our bias, then there'll be a perspective. But because there has to be an angle of vision, but that perspective will become either less biased or free of bias. Okay. So the first thing on the issue of perspective is to see whether our perspective is prejudiced or not. And the second interesting thing is whether we are bringing in only one perspective or we are discussing the issue from many different perspectives. Okay. So, for example, uh, historians have been helped here by authors and filmmakers. If you see a film, if you read a story of Premchand or of Dickens or any of the great novelists, you will see that they write in such a way that many different perspectives come into play automatically. They don't have to say that these are the 4 different interpretations of this situation. They don't have to say that, but automatically they will tell you about a situation, they will describe a situation, and you'll be able to see that in this situation, take the example of Namak Ka Daroga, that story of Premchand's. You'll be able to see what is the perspective of the peasant, what is the perspective of the inspector, what is the perspective of the state, right, of the district collector, what is the perspective of the peasant's wife. You'll be able to see all the different perspectives. And what is the perspective of the author himself? Okay, so you'll be able to see that. Therefore, what is important here is that they are able to present many different perspectives. And historians must learn from them. And historians too must present anything from all the different perspectives that are available to them. Not only that of a particular historian, suppose not only that of the author, but also of other historians. And then they must debate the validity of these perspectives. This is sometimes called heteroglossia. So historians should practice what is called heteroglossia. Okay, that is help reveal the pluralities of a given history. Talk of many different ways in which the past has been seen by different people. That is why, if you remember, when we made our books in the National Council of Educational Research and Training, textbooks for classes 6 and 7 and 8, those textbooks were called I'll just add a capital S in the end, our pasts. उन textbooks का नाम ही था our pasts. It was not called our past. These are textbooks in Indian history, class 6, class 7, class 8. नाम है हमारे अतीत, हमारा अतीत नहीं, हमारे अतीत, क्योंकि हम सभी का तमिलनाडु में, पंजाब में, बिहार में, दिल्ली में एक अतीत नहीं है, कई अतीत हैं, अलग अलग, अलग अलग पर्सपेक्टिव्स हैं, अलग अलग एक्सपीरियंसेस हैं, एक ही हिस्ट्री के अलग अलग एक्सपीरियंसेस हो सकते हैं. तो इसलिए वो जो हेट्रोग्लॉसिया है उसे हमें कैप्चर करना चाहिए. नाउ देयर इज अ हिस्टोरियन कॉल्ड पीटर बर्क. ओके, पीटर बर्क says that very often you interpret conflict through a conflict of interpretations. Right? See, history often consists of many conflicts. इतिहास में झगड़ों की कमी नहीं है, वाकई झगड़ों की कमी नहीं है. तो अगर झगड़ों की कमी नहीं है तो आप कॉन्फ्लिक्ट को कैसे इंटरप्रेट करते हैं? यू इंटरप्रेट कॉन्फ्लिक्ट थ्रू अ कॉन्फ्लिक्ट ऑफ इंटरप्रिटेशंस. जैसे अभिजीत जी ने 10 मिनट पहले बताया, आप जो व्याख्याएं हैं उनके बीच डिबेट कराते हैं, उनके बीच कॉन्फ्लिक्ट बनाते हैं और उसके जरिए जो पास्ट के कॉन्फ्लिक्ट्स हैं उनको इंटरप्रेट करते हैं. सो दिस मीन्स हेटेरोग्लॉसिया. Another word for heteroglossia, I'll just write here in front of heteroglossia itself, is multivocality. So there should be multi-vocality in our history. Okay? Take, for instance, the issue that I have written about, the partition of British India. In writing comprehensively about this topic, so many perspectives have to be kept in mind of the major political parties, of 2 or even 3 nations, of 4 nations, that is India, Britain and Pakistan, and later one part of Pakistan became Bangladesh. So there are, different nations here, also of people of different backgrounds, of the young man who lay hidden among the dead before he could run for his life from Jammu to Sialkot, of the woman performing back-breaking road repairs on a highway in eastern India. इन लोगों के लिए पार्टीशन क्या था? जो एक कमर तोड़ मेहनत कर रही है महिला, सड़क बना रही है पूर्वी भारत में कहीं पे, जो आज बांग्लादेश हो गया, उस औरत के लिए पार्टीशन वही था जो जिन्ना के लिए था। जो लाशों में छुप छुप के, लाशों के बीच लेट लेट के आदमी भागा जम्मू से सियालकोट की तरफ, उसके लिए पार्टीशन क्या वही था जो पटेल और नेहरू के लिए था या माउंटबैटन के लिए था? तो इस तरह से there are different kinds of people with different backgrounds, right? We have to keep them in mind. Of the trader who sold wheat at wholesale prices in the retail market, eking out a living by making a few paise through the sale of gunny bags in which the wheat came. Of the women who were persuaded by the menfolk in their families to protect community honor and to commit mass suicide by falling in wells. Of couples of mixed background who ran away from hospitals to God-forsaken trenches to give birth to children. So there are so many stories, so many actors, so many voices. Do our accounts of the partition and the names we use for partition pay heed to all these voices? Was this really a partition, a more or less agreed upon division of assets and territories? Or was it a disturbance, a tumult, a genocide, or a civil war that raged for 16 months? Why don't we call it the creation of Pakistan? हम पार्टीशन शब्द ही क्यों इस्तेमाल करते हैं? एक दूसरे वैंटेज पॉइंट से देखा जाए तो पाकिस्तानी कहेंगे ये पार्टीशन नहीं है, ये तो पाकिस्तान का बनना है. So we can call it the creation of Pakistan. Why didn't the historians' history speak of partition's untold brutality and violence until the mid-1990s? When did partition begin and when did it end? So many questions. Different ways of looking at a phenomenon yield different questions, let alone different answers. So this is why perspective is important. Because when you bring in many different perspectives, you can see anything from different angles. And as Abhijit rightly said, that enriches our history writing. Okay? So the point is that history is not something fixed, objective, based only on facts. In the early 20th century, some historians, those who were editing the Cambridge Modern History, and many, many historians used to speak of the voice of history. कहते थे भाई हिस्ट्री की एक कोई ऑब्जेक्टिव आवाज है. जैसे कभी कभी बॉलीवुड की फिल्में भी कहती हैं आज कि इतिहास गवाह है कि ऐसा ऐसा हुआ. तो इतिहास कैसे गवाह हो सकता है? How can history be a witness? It is Shishir or Abhijit or Umesh or Renu or Malika who make history a witness. It is the historian who says that history is witness. History cannot be witness on its own. So there cannot be a voice of history. There are many different voices in history. Okay? Is there a voice in history? And should uncovering this be the historian's ideal? Or are there many different voices even opposed voices in history. If there are opposed voices, then we have to understand conflict. We have to interpret conflict through a conflict of interpretations. We have to capture the varied and opposed voices in any history. And then the question comes, which interpretation is important? Which perspective is right? Which perspective is more correct than others? And as Umeshji said, the one answer to this is that those perspectives which come coupled with sufficient, adequate, weighty evidence and facts, and are able to therefore yield persuasive arguments where I can defend my claim, those perspectives are valid. जहां पे मैं कह सकता हूं कि मेरे दावे के पीछे पर्याप्त साक्ष्य हैं, पर्याप्त तथ्य हैं और उसे एक बैकिंग प्रदान करता है एविडेंस. Those sorts of perspectives are valid. Okay. So when we do history like this, we are able to ensure that we come up with something that is persuasive. Finally, I will say to you, so perspective is number 5. And finally, I will say to you that there's a 6th category, right? There is a 6th category in all this, in the writing of history. And can anyone think of what that 6th category may be? Anybody? You know, I used to always ask my students, is there a 6th element in the writing of history, or are these 5 elements, do they capture everything? शिशिर जी, आप अपने थीसिस को याद कीजिए, अभी खत्म किया है, तो उसमें ये 5 चीजें हैं, लेकिन कोई छठी चीज है?
एंटीथीसिस.
हाँ,
एंटीथीसिस.
एंटीथीसिस तो ऑपोजिट पर्सपेक्टिव हो गया ना
जी,
तो वो तो पर्सपेक्टिव में ही आ गया ना,
पर्सपेक्टिव में ही आ गया
ना, उनके मल्टी वोकैलिटी होनी चाहिए, हेटेरोग्लॉसिया होना चाहिए. ओके,
पर्सपेक्टिव में आ गया जी.
हाँ, तो छठी चीज क्या है?
ये तो मेरे ख्याल से इंटर रिलेशन बिटवीन ऑल 5, ऊपर के 5 को कैसे आप इंटर रिलेट करते हो,
वो नैरेटिव है. कैसे आप इंटर रिलेट करोगे, वो आर्ग्यूमेंट और नैरेटिव है
जी.
वो अलग चीज नहीं है ना, वो तो नैरेटिव है. आप अपने बयानबाजी के जरिए ही रिलेट करोगे, नैरेटिव के जरिए ही करोगे.
एक और है, उसको हम कह सकते हैं मल्टी डिसिप्लिनरी अप्रोच.
नहीं, तो वो जो बाकी डिसिप्लिन से आर्ग्यूमेंट आएगा, बाकी डिसिप्लिन से एविडेंस को देखने के तरीके आ सकते हैं, बाकी डिसिप्लिन से एक और चीज भी आ सकती है. वो छठी चीज क्या है?
कंक्लूजन सर.
से भी आ सकती है.
कंक्लूजन.
Conclusion is only a summary of the first 5, so it's not separate.
Okay.
Right. But I think the 6th thing is
substantiate the fact.
नहीं, फैक्ट आप सब्सटैंशिएट करेंगे एविडेंस से. एविडेंस नहीं है तो फैक्ट नहीं सब्सटैंशिएट होगा. और एविडेंस से, इफ यू मेक अ कनेक्शन बिटवीन सोर्स, एविडेंस एंड फैक्ट, right? You say this is the primary source, this has yielded this evidence, I have looked at this evidence critically, this is the way in which I've looked at it critically, this is the way I've contextualized it, and this contextualization, critical look at the evidence reveals these facts, so that is covered. Then the fact is substantiated. I have kept facts separate. Some people say, why do you keep facts separate? Because once the facts are substantiated, they have a life of their own. Right? But what is the 6th thing? The 6th thing is
category.
categories and concepts, right? Now, when we are writing history, when we are teaching history, I will use many categories and many concepts. And we must be able to use those concepts correctly. Okay. So, for example, in a sense, the word perspective, the word bias, these are categories. The word rebellion is a category. The word revolution is a category. Category मतलब आप उसको जब छांटते हैं चीज को तो आप उसको कहाँ रखते हैं? सन 57, 1857. Was it a rebellion? Was it a revolution? Was it a war of independence? Right? What was it? So, or was it a mutiny? Now, all of these are categories. Now, unless I know what is a mutiny, unless I know the right meaning, the technically correct meaning of the word mutiny, or of rebellion, or of revolution, or of war of independence, how can I decide whether 1857 is this or that? Okay. In some cases, we use very significant and weighty concepts, such as capitalism. If you and I are to argue about capitalism, Umeshji may be against capitalism. I may be in favor of capitalism. But how can he and I argue unless we know and agree on what is capitalism? So capitalism is a concept whose definition we must agree on. So we must know what it is accurately. Just as we must know what is a rebellion, what is a revolution, what is a mutiny. Sometimes certain concepts are and certain categories are very close to each other, like patriotism, nationalism, देश भक्ति, राष्ट्रवाद, एक जैसे से लगते हैं, right? So, how do we distinguish between them? We must be able to distinguish between concepts that look similar. Desh, Rashtra. In the context of present times, the category or the notion of the prevalence of disease. Then there is something called incidence of disease. COVID का वक्त है, तो COVID के ऊपर जो लोग लिख रहे हैं, they talk of the prevalence of disease and the incidence of disease. These are closely related but different concepts. So some concepts are so closely related that unless we know what exactly a concept is, that particular concept is, unless we are able to understand the concept correctly, we will not be able to write our history correctly, because history is written through language, and language is plastic, and language, any word or phrase can mean many things. And therefore, I have to tell people, what do I mean by such and such? Okay. What do I mean by perspective? What do I mean by bias? What do I mean by nationalism, by patriotism, by capitalism, etc., etc. So I say to you that in our writing and teaching of history, conceptual clarity and a clarity about categories is very significant. I will end by saying that all history writing consists of these 6 things only. Okay? These 6 things only. All history writing. I challenge you to think for 2 minutes whether there is a 7th element. If there is a 7th element, it is only a subset of these 6. This is my claim. ये मेरा दावा है कि सारी हिस्ट्री राइटिंग में सिर्फ ये 6 चीजें हैं. अगर कोई 7वीं चीज है तो इन 6 का ही अंश है, इन 6 के बाहर नहीं है. और अगर आपको कभी भी ये समझ आए कि कोई 7वीं इंडिपेंडेंट एलिमेंट है हिस्ट्री राइटिंग में, तो आप मुझे लिखिए, बताइए, तो मैं अपना सारा हाउ इज हिस्ट्री डन का एनालिसिस बदल डालूंगा. और अगर मैं बच्चा होता तो कहता कि मैं अपना नाम भी बदल डालूं. ठीक है? तो ये मेरा दावा है that all history writing consists only of these 6 major elements. There is no 7th major element at all. It is an interplay, an imbrication of these 6 things. Yeah? That is where I'll end. Thank you. If there are any questions, we can take the questions. What I will do is I will send you a written document on this also. I've written about this for teachers in an online journal called Samuhik Pahel. It has been written in just about 2,400 words because there was a word limit. So it's not too many pages. It's about 5 pages. And when you, distribute this video, you can send the written piece with it. And of course, it has to be duly edited. And maybe after 15 days, I can do this once more with a PPT as well. Right?
Okay. Thank you, Anil.